Today, a very sad story awaits us. Imagine the highest point on Earth, Everest. Near its base, a helicopter flies by, carrying a 9-year-old girl named Shriya, who has set out with her parents on an excursion to the sacred mountain. This flight will mark the beginning of a dream and, at the same time, the beginning of a tragedy that will shake the entire mountaineering community. Now go ahead and drop a like, and we'll move on to our story. More than 70 years ago, Everest was first summited by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay. Since then, a lot has changed. The equipment has changed. The approach to climbing has changed. Mountaineering as a whole has changed. Only the mountains remain the same, just as alluring and just as dangerous. Back in the days of Edmund Hillary, high-altitude mountaineering was the domain of a select few highly trained athletes willing to take extreme risks. Today, the situation has changed dramatically. If you happen to have at least $100,000 to spare, then even if you have never been in the mountains and are not an athlete, but simply want a line on your resume that says, "You climbed Everest," you can afford it. Numerous commercial companies are ready to offer you such a service and will promise to take you to any summit. They will assure you that they will do everything for you, practically leading you up Everest by the hand. What they will not tell you is that over the entire history of ascents, more than 320 climbers have remained on the mountain, and around 200 bodies still cannot be brought down. In recent years, the percentage of those who never return from the mountain has risen sharply, and most of them are commercial climbers. Despite this, people continue to answer the call of the mountain. But now, let's move on to our story. Shriya Shah-Klorfine was born in the shadow of Everest, in Nepal's capital, Kathmandu. Her family bore the same last name as members of the royal family and was held in high regard. According to Shriya's friends, her grandfather was a high-ranking official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the family's mansion in Kathmandu was located just a few blocks from the old royal palace. As I mentioned earlier, when the girl was 9 years old, her father took the entire family on a trip to the base of the sacred mountain Everest, revered by Hindus, and they flew there by helicopter. This trip stayed in young Shriya's heart and sparked a dream to one day reach the summit of the sacred mountain. Here is how she later recalled it. "The sun was rising over Everest. The sight took my breath away, and I thought, one day I will do it. One day I will reach the summit." But just a year after that flight, when the girl was only 10 years old, her father passed away, and the family moved to Mumbai. Her teenage years were not easy either. First, her older brother was killed in a car accident, and then her mother passed away suddenly. Shriya returned briefly to Kathmandu to study at a university. But when she turned 21, she took a job as an accountant on a cruise ship and decided to see the world. It was on that ship that she met Bruce Chlorfine, a talented pianist from Ontario. Despite the differences in age, mentality, and religion, they decided to get married. However, Shriya's family followed strict traditions, and her mother was supposed to choose her husband. Before her death, she had even selected a doctor from Mumbai for her. But Shriya broke with tradition, and in 2002, the couple got married. Her sister was so upset that she never spoke to her again. After the wedding, Shriya moved to Canada to live with her husband. In Toronto, her life began to improve, and she went into business, achieving considerable success. Shriya started a company that sourced designer clothing and even opened several boutiques. In 2011, she ran for the Canadian Parliament. As her husband said, she was ambitious, persistent, and approached everything she did with passion. Then, suddenly, She told her husband that she was going to climb Everest, and that she had carried this childhood dream with her all those years. Bruce was surprised, as they had never really discussed it before. A friend recalls that in 2010, Shriya had suddenly decided to enlist in the Canadian Army, specifically in a combat unit. Later, that idea transformed into the goal of summiting Everest. The original plan was for the climb to serve as a charity fundraiser for sick children. The only problem was that Shriya was not a mountaineer. Her only experience with the mountains had been in Nepal, when she completed a short trek at an altitude of 3,000 meters. So, with zero mountaineering experience, she was not even an athlete and was not in good physical shape. But she began training persistently. She took up rock climbing and started practicing karate, preparing for her ascent of Everest. In the fall of 2011, she launched a website featuring several edited photos of herself standing against the backdrop of Everest. The site declared her goal: to become the first Canadian woman of South Asian descent to summit Everest. As you can see, setting records is becoming harder and harder. The website also announced a fundraiser for the climb, but aside from her friends, no one was in a hurry to donate. And as I mentioned earlier, climbing Everest is very expensive. Nepal charges thousands of dollars for permits, Sherpa services, the services of a commercial expedition company, and more. For her ascent, Shriya chose a relatively new guiding company called Utmost Adventure Trekking. Their services cost between $36,000 and $40,000. By Everest standards, that is considered fairly budget-friendly. Even so, with flights, gear, food, and the climb itself, the total came to around $100,000. As expected, the fundraising effort completely failed, and Shriya had to mortgage the home she shared with Bruce in order to fulfill her childhood dream. This obsessive goal of conquering Everest began to put a serious strain on her marriage, and Shriya spent more and more time staying with friends. Still, her husband came to the airport to say goodbye when she departed for Nepal. Her friends gave her a red sweater with a Canadian flag on the chest and wished her a successful climb. On the phone, Shriya said that upon arriving in Nepal, her company told her, "You'll be taught everything. You have nothing to worry about. You'll have an 18-day trek to base camp, and there we'll teach you how to use ladders and climbing equipment." She arrived at base camp on April 12th. Like most commercial operators in Nepal, Utmost Adventure did not spend much time vetting their clients. The company required a medical certificate confirming fitness to climb, and that was it. As we can see, her complete lack of mountaineering experience did not raise any concerns. The company's director said he had asked Shriya about her preparation. Here is his comment: "It's very important to be in good shape to climb Everest. She told me she had trained all year. She was in good condition." At Everest Base Camp, Shriya did go through several training sessions. However, most of the time, people simply sat and waited for good weather. The so-called weather window that allows for a relatively safe ascent of Everest appears only a few times each season. That's why base camp fills with climbers who spend each day watching the mountain and waiting for their moment to ascend. Shriya called her friends and her husband almost every day on a satellite phone, and, overall, felt fine. Here is what her friend Priya recalls. She was full of life. She was very, very happy. She told me, "Priya, I can see myself at the summit." On May 18, 2012, Shriya set out on her ascent. It took her 18 hours to climb roughly 1 kilometer vertically. She was among the last to leave Camp 4, the final point before the summit push. On the evening of the 18th, she joined the tail end of a line of climbers and guides winding its way up the steep slope of the mountain. That season, a weather window had not appeared for a long time, and a huge number of climbers had accumulated on the mountain, all waiting for this crucial moment. If they missed this opportunity, they would lose their chance to reach the summit, lose their money, months of preparation, disappoint sponsors, and possibly never have such an opportunity again in their lives. As a result, the climb that day forced around 500 people to head upward. After leaving Camp 4, Shriya entered the so-called death zone, above 8,000 meters. At that altitude, the air is so thin that even the slightest movement requires tremendous effort. Supplemental oxygen helps keep you alive, but it is unlikely to make you any faster if you are an inexperienced climber. The route, first established by Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay in May 1953, is now heavily worn. Along nearly its entire length, fixed ropes are in place. Starting from the South Col, climbers make their way up onto the glacier and then trudge along the steep slope of the mountain. From there, using ice axes and crampons, they work their way through snowy couloirs toward the so-called balcony, a small ledge at an altitude of 8,400 meters. It is a brief resting point, and if any exhausted climbers are still able to appreciate it, it offers an extraordinary view of the surrounding peaks. The balcony is also a place where many climbers turn around and begin their descent, realizing that time is running out and they no longer have the strength to continue. But if they decide to push on, they move along the ridge, scrambling over rocks and wading waist-deep through snow until they reach the south summit, a small ice-covered dome at 8,750 meters. From there, the route drops again into a saddle and then rises once more along a sharp snow cornice, flanked by 3-kilometer drops on either side. The penultimate obstacle is the Hillary Step, a 12-meter rock wall. On the other side lies the highest point on Earth, 8,848 meters above sea level, the summit of Everest. Those who make it to the top usually spend only a few minutes, or even just seconds, there. In ideal weather, temperatures at the summit of Everest are around -15 degrees Celsius, but due to strong winds, it feels much colder. In addition, climbers are in a state of extreme physical exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. So after taking a few photos, they hurry back down. On May 19, 2012, another factor was added, a queue of Lundbergs waiting to stand on the summit, and they expended even more energy. As statistics show, most incidents happen during the descent, when climbers are already out of strength and, most importantly, out of oxygen. But let's return to May 19, 2012. Here is how that day is remembered by mountaineer Ganesh Thakuri, who is also the director of the company Utmost Adventure, with which Shriya was climbing. There were traffic jams at the couloirs and at the balcony. My partner and I had to stand in the snow for 2 hours, waiting our turn to cross the final section. On the way back, I met Shriya and her 2 sherpas at the south summit. It was already well past noon, and we were beyond what is normally considered a safe window for the ascent. In the second half of the day, winds on Everest typically strengthen and often reach hurricane force. That is why climbers aim to reach the summit before 11 a.m. and begin their descent as quickly as possible before the weather deteriorates. Thakuri recalls that he began pleading with the woman to turn back. She had already spent too long in the death zone, and the weather was getting worse. But she simply pushed him away and said, "I don't want to go back. There is no turning back. I am going to the summit." Shilkuon. Here is what Thakuri says about it. Most clients of Ultimate Adventure sign a contract stating that they will follow the Sherpa's instructions. But at an altitude of 8,000 meters, that is hardly possible to enforce. The problem is that if she refuses to listen, we cannot carry her down. However, Shriya was not the only one who ignored the Sherpa's advice. A 16-year-old Nepali girl and a Swiss climber also chose to continue their ascent. Ganesh Thakuri managed to convince only 3 clients from Slovakia, who were attempting to climb without oxygen, to turn back. They began their descent. But despite everything, at 2:30 p.m. Nepal time, Shriya reached the summit of Everest and fulfilled her childhood dream. Her guides, Temba Sherpa and Dawa Dandi Sherpa, radioed base camp shortly after 3 p.m. local time to report that the remaining members of the group had also successfully reached the summit and had begun their descent. But the descent did not go as planned. Shriya was moving more slowly than the others, and by the time she reached the south summit, she could barely stand. Her speech was slurred, and she was no longer fully aware of what was happening around her. This was the result of altitude sickness. The body is not receiving enough oxygen, which can cause pulmonary edema, or, in Shriya's case, most likely cerebral edema. As night began to fall, the Sherpas took turns trying to help her descend, supporting her under the arms as she could no longer walk on her own. But soon she collapsed onto the snow and could not get up again. They then began dragging her, trying to bring her down to the rocky couloirs where they could call for help. She had already been on the mountain for more than 24 hours and was breathing from her 9th oxygen cylinder. The Sherpas were carrying this enormous burden. By the way, many people in the comments ask why they don't just bring extra oxygen cylinders. At that altitude, even blinking is difficult, and a few extra kilograms of oxygen can become an unbearable load. In commercial expeditions, Sherpas usually carry them, but even their strength is not unlimited. Shriya was already on her 9th oxygen cylinder, unable to descend on her own, and the weather was beginning to worsen. John Kudrowski, a geography professor and mountaineer from Colorado, was part of a team that abandoned their summit attempt that day and decided to return to camp, hoping the crowds would disperse the following day. After reaching the top of the glacier, he saw 8 Sherpas trying to drag something across the snow. On his way back early in the morning of May 20th, just below the balcony, Kudrowski encountered He Wen-yi, a Chinese climber who, suffering from altitude sickness, had lost his orientation. He had fallen off the trail into the snow and was hallucinating. He had removed one of his gloves and was clearly suffering from frostbite in temperatures that had dropped below -40 degrees. Kudrowski says, "I found his glove in the snow and tried to put it back on, but his hand was frozen like stone. The delirious Wen-yi struck at the glove and the wind blew it away. I stood there for about a minute, then decided to leave. I realized I couldn't help him, but I could save my own life." Near the couloirs, Kudrowski saw several more frozen bodies and began descending more quickly toward base camp. Just above the camp, he met another member of his group, David O'Brien. That night, the British climber O'Brien had abandoned his summit attempt and spent hours helping bring climbers down. When Kudrowski arrived, he was helping a Polish climber who had fallen into the snow. The man was less than half an hour from the tent, but he could not go any further. O'Brien tried to give him an injection of dexedrine, but the liquid had frozen in the syringe. In the end, Sherpas picked him up and began carrying him down, and when O'Brien encountered him several days later at Camp 3, the man did not remember being rescued. Alpinist Sandra Leduc from Edmonton also left Camp 4 on the evening of May 19th and headed toward the summit. She had been climbing for more than 10 years. The first victim of the mountain she encountered that evening on the glacier was a young woman being carried down across the snow on a stretcher. Half frozen, she was moaning in pain. Higher up, she could see 3 or 4 more teams supporting climbers under the arms as they were on the verge of collapse. The scene reminded her of the aftermath of a medieval battle. Ahead, she saw three figures lying on the snow. As she got closer, she realized they were dead bodies, still attached to the climbing ropes. Sandra had to climb over them as they were blocking the path. Here is what she says. "I was in shock. It's not something you expect to see. All the dead climbers had already lost their gloves. But what struck me most was that the woman in the bright red jacket still had her headlamp on, and they were only 45 minutes away from the safe camp where rescue was possible. By the time Sandra met Kudrowski, she was also in trouble. The regulator on her oxygen mask had frozen, and oxygen stopped flowing. She began suffering from altitude sickness and could have been left on the mountain as well. But Kudrowski helped her descend to Camp 4 and put her in a tent. The next day, they all began descending together toward base camp. Meanwhile, the body of the woman with the headlamp still on, which had so struck Sandra, remained in the couloirs. But by then, everyone already knew it was Shriya. Someone even covered her with a Canadian flag. On May 19th, the Sherpas who had accompanied her, exhausted and suffering from hypothermia, returned to Camp 4 without her. When dawn broke in Nepal, a search and rescue team was assembled. Unable to move her frozen body, rescuers took photographs to confirm her identity. Under her jacket, she was wearing a red sweater with a maple leaf, the very one her friends had given her before departure. In addition to Shriya, 9 more people died on the south and north sides of the mountain. Most of them perished within a 48-hour window between May 19th and 20th. The body of Chinese climber He Wen-yi was found in the couloirs, as well as the body of Song Won-bin from South Korea. Slightly higher up, beneath the balcony, a German doctor died, and on the north side a Spanish doctor perished, along with another German who froze to death after falling and breaking his leg. All of them reached the summit but were unable to descend. Later, Sherpas managed to bring Shriya's body down to a zone accessible by helicopter, and it was transported to Mumbai. The operation reportedly cost her family $50,000. She was 33 years old. So, what is this story about? Obsession with a dream? Madness? A terrible tragedy? Yes, about all of that. But that is only the emotional layer, so to speak, the tip of the iceberg. In reality, this case, along with several similar ones, deeply shook the mountaineering community. Everyone now understands that mountaineering has changed significantly. Back in the early 1990s, it was almost impossible to hear the words Everest and tourist in the same sentence. Mountaineering was the domain of professionals, a kind of exclusive community of the chosen few. Today, as we can see, the mountains are filled with commercial tourists. Expedition companies are growing like mushrooms after the rain. Nepal issues a record number of climbing permits every year, and the tension between professional climbers and tourists has already reached its limit. Old-school alpinists are angered by the fact that tourists treat the mountains as entertainment and a way to gain followers. They are irritated by the banners hung near tents, the noise on social media, and the fact that true legendary climbers are often less known than some model who took a photo on the summit surrounded by Sherpas who carried her up there. But again, this is all emotion. The fact is that unprepared climbers are creating traffic jams on the routes to the summits. If an exhausted climber gets stuck somewhere in a narrow section, and there are plenty of such sections on the route to Everest, everyone following behind is forced to wait in line. And not everyone is able to wait it out to the end. For many, that queue becomes the last one they ever stand in. Meanwhile, experienced climbers lose the opportunity to complete their ascent, lose money, lose months of training, and so on. Another equally important issue is the qualification requirement for the climb. As we understood from this story, to climb Everest, you only need a medical certificate confirming that you are healthy enough to do it. And the fact that many people have zero experience in high-altitude mountaineering is not seen as a problem at all. These are the kinds of issues that exist on Everest expeditions. And despite everything, our protagonist managed to fulfill her childhood dream, albeit at such a cost. If you have thoughts on this tragedy, feel free to share them.